talking about at the coffee rush, that's where we had our speaker tonight. First time he spoke was at Coffee Rush. He was so entertaining that we wanted to have him back because this is a different type of speaker. He's at one time, not that long ago, didn't know anything about birds. And he'll tell you his story, but he's going to talk about going from bugs and enjoying bugs to the challenge of becoming a birder. So here we have Evan Waite, Dr. Evan Waite. Oh, not yet? Oh, when's that going to happen? So from ASU, Evan, here you are. Oh, and if you can hold your questions till at the end, please.
I mean, I don't mind, but. All right, well, thank you, Kathleen, for that. Hello, everyone. My name is Evan Waite, and I'd like to thank you all for being here either virtually or in person. As Kathleen said, I am a PhD student in evolutionary biology at Arizona State University, and my background is in entomology, the study of insects. But not that long ago, I started getting into birding. So today's talk is going to be focused on kind of being able to juggle and manage to do both and talk about really the differences in what I noticed, what I do professionally, and getting into the world of birds. Okay. Minor technical difficulty. There we go.
It's showing your notes on my side.
Oh, okay.
If that's okay.
I don't mind. All right, so the people on Zoom get to peek behind the curtain of what I'm going to say. That's all right. So anyway, my educational background from the very beginning has been in entomology. I received a bachelor's of science from the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida in 2017, before pursuing a master's in biological sciences at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas. Now that one is a little bit more general, but I was using insects as my study organism. And as I just mentioned, I'm currently pursuing a PhD at ASU in evolutionary biology, again, using insects as my study organism. What I particularly work on is the group of insects known as the beetles, and even more specifically, the family Carabidae, or the ground beetles in the United States. My first research project with them was my master's project, where I looked at how grazing and land management affected ground beetle community composition, so species diversity, species turnover, and things like that. And then moving here to ASU, I'm working on creating identification resources for a national ecological project that collects ground beetles for the next 30 years to kind of create baseline data that long-term scientists can use to see how communities change over time. Additionally, I've got some other projects going on, like redefining some genera and describing new species. I found my first new to science ground beetle like 3 weeks ago. So that's in the pipeline now, and I'm very excited about that. But why would I be here talking to the Audubon Society if I wasn't going to be bringing up birds, right? Well, my journey into birding started last summer at the end of August. So I work with the ASU Natural History Collections, and at the end of the summer, usually kind of peak monsoon season, we set up a big lab trip where we bring together the botanists, mammalogists, herpetologists, entomologists, everybody gets together. We pick a mountain range and we go camp out and see what we can find. August of 2021, we went down to the Patagonia Mountains, and as you can see from the photos here, the scenery was great. And after a couple hours of being there, we ended up finding a lot of really good stuff. So the plant life was super exciting. We found some mammals in a cave. I saw my lifer ridge-nosed rattlesnake, which is our state reptile. But you'll notice that there's not any photos of insects on here. For me, it wasn't that exciting of a trip because the group that I really am passionate about wasn't super prevalent. These photos don't really show it, but half of our camp kind of got washed out from a torrential end of season downpour. And I do a lot of my insect collecting at night. So with the rain and being high up in the canyon or high up in the mountain like we were, temperatures overnight were not really conducive to insect collecting. I was having a great time, but I just wasn't seeing a lot of insects. But while we were kind of salvaging camp from that downpour, I would hear some people kind of off in the distance go, "Oh, was that a Mexican jay?" Or "Did you see that acorn woodpecker?" And I was mad. I didn't know those birds, so I didn't really appreciate what they were looking at. And so at that trip, while I was trying to dry out my sleeping bag for the night, I decided I'm going to go home and I'm going to try to figure out birds. So for the next couple of weeks, I started talking to friends either locally or back east in Kansas or Pennsylvania that I knew were interested in birds and kind of asked them, "What's the deal? What do I need to pick up?" And they said, "You need field guide and you need some binoculars." So after a few weeks of mulling it over, checking out different things at bookstores, I picked up the second edition of Sibley's. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, so I picked this one up because I assumed I would be doing some birding in Arizona, but also back east. So rather just have the whole thing covered right away. And I borrowed a pair of Vortex Crossfire binoculars from Jay Taylor, the ASU ornithology professor. And with that, I was geared up, ready to go out birding for the first time. But I had to decide where to go. And I had a vague understanding of how eBird worked. And so I went on there to check out some of the local hotspots. I found somewhere that was relatively close to home, had a lot of species recorded from it, and was someplace that I was actually familiar with. In 2019, before COVID hit, I served as an insect expert for a BioBlitz here at the Gilbert Riparian Preserve. And so I was familiar with this area. And for those of you that aren't, the Riparian Preserve is located in Gilbert, Arizona, and has recorded over 320 species of birds in the property and has over 17,000 eBird lists submitted from it. So this was where I was going on my first day. And the results of that first day were this nice little checklist of 20 species. On this first day out, I found 20 species and I was here for about 5 hours. That is not a great return on investment time-wise, but I had never actively looked at a bird before, so I was just taking my time, figuring out the binoculars, figuring out how to use the field guide. And as I walked in, I looked at some of the species that I was already familiar with, things like mallards and American coots. I was never interested in birds really before this, but I've been outside enough that I could pick up on those too. So I was using my field guide, just checking out their field marks. And the first bird that was completely new to me that I tried to identify with that field guide was an Abert's towhee. Thankfully, they're very plentiful and not super skittish here. So I had enough time to get extended looks at them where I was able to pick out and basically picture match what I was looking at. I didn't really know what field marks I should be looking for. I didn't really know how to use the field guide. I was simply trying to take the bird and the binoculars and match it to the picture. And thankfully, the Abert's towhee is pretty obvious with the pale bill, the dark mask, the pale tail. I didn't take too long to match it up. But Abert's towhees will always kind of hold a special place because they were the first bird that I actively identified on my own. Now, some of you may have noticed the date of this first eBird list, October 9th of 2021. By my accounts, today is October 11th of 2022. So just this past Sunday, I had my official 1-year anniversary as a birder. Well, thank you. So the rest of this talk isn't going to be like a big year review or anything like that. We're not going to go through species by species, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of how I got into this and things that I've noticed coming from an entomology perspective, and give a little kind of 1-year summary of how we're doing. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference in kind of your daily use tools. Basically, binoculars versus a microscope. At work, this is what I use every day. I sit at a computer, but also to the left is always just my microscope, so I spend just as much, if not more time looking through this than at my computer screen. And this is what's called a dissecting microscope. So this is maybe a little different than the type you're used to. This one has all of this space here underneath, and I'm sorry for people on Zoom that can't see my pointer, but it has all this space here under the objective lens to actually manipulate and move specimens around. Then back here you have the focus, and up here you have the zoom lens. What's unique about this compared to most other microscopes is you can have different magnifications without having to change the lens. So if we take a look at through my microscope, basically zoomed all the way out, this is what you would see. And this is already magnified, of course. And truthfully, this is probably the closest most of you have seen one of these ground beetles. But if I need to look at something even more specific on that beetle, you can zoom in on these specific areas and see a lot more detail. You can see the little hairs on the antenna. You can see the detail of the eye on the wings here. You can see this piece of dust that I probably should have cleaned off before taking this photo. But when you're looking at things like this, oftentimes you'll see talking about looking at characters at like 40x or 100x. And that's telling you basically what magnification that you're looking at. Getting into birding, I of course had to figure out binoculars. And even though they're relatively simple in their construction, and these are all relatively easy, simplistic to figure out how to use, I didn't know what 8x32 meant. I didn't know what 10x42 meant. In the microscope world, this would be 420 times magnification, and that just didn't seem right to me. So after a little bit of reading, I found out, of course, that the first number is the magnification, and the second number is the size of the lens. But the difference between the microscope is you can't zoom in further with a pair of binoculars. If you need to get closer up on that bird to see a feature on it, you have to start walking. So this was something new to get used to. And these are the two things that you basically use every day in either discipline. But there are some instances where you might need a different piece of equipment. And for the entomology world, that is called a compound microscope. These are the ones you might be more familiar with from like science classes, where you have the 3 objective lenses that you can turn to increase rotation. And then you're looking at things basically on microscope slides. I don't use these very often. I would say maybe probably less than 5 times a year. But in those instances when I need it, it's really nice to have this tool available. And now, just kind of note, I'm going to be talking about my entomological experience. There are entomologists that use these every day. I just do not. And when you're looking at these sorts of things, you're going to be looking at things mounted on slides. So you can do that with whole insects like you see up here, this little frog hopper and this fly. These are cockroach mouth parts. Here's a moth antenna. But things that are very, very small, generally very flat, or that you need really high magnification to look at. This doesn't really apply to what I do, but again, it's nice to have that option. Getting into the world of birding, I was kind of trying to figure out what the corollary here was, and I decided that it was the spotting scope. This is something that you don't necessarily need to get involved with birding, but when you have those instances where you want to use it or you want higher magnification or a further distance, this is what you need to pick up. So I wasn't initially intending to buy a spotting scope because I wasn't sure if I was really going to stick with birding. I didn't want to put in the money, but I have a friend and a colleague named Steve Mason, who is an ornithologist turned entomologist. So we're passing each other going opposite ways on the highway. While I was back home last year for Christmas, he said that he had a spotting scope he didn't really use and gifted me this. Very kind of him. And definitely recommend picking one up if you can. So I was just playing around trying to figure out all the legs on the tripod and how to zoom in on things. And behind this white building over there, I ended up seeing something on the top of that telephone pole. You might just barely be able to make it out in this right image. There's a little tiny blob up at the top. And with my binoculars, all I could really see was the blob. But using the full power of this spotting scope, I was able to tell and very clearly identify that that was a bald eagle. And as an entomologist, where I have to have my thing in hand under a microscope to identify it, this blew my mind that I was able to identify this thing on Google Earth. This point from the scope to where that pole is a little under half a mile away. That is ridiculous range to be able to actually identify something at. One skill that's really transferred and really helped me kind of in both of these disciplines is taking photos through the respective optic, digibinning, digiscoping, whatever you want to call it. But I've been taking of pictures of insects through my microscope for years now, and it takes practice to line up the lens, to line up with the microscope, to get the lighting right and the zoom and everything. And I've been taking these photos because I feel that insects are often underappreciated because they're small and nobody's able to see like that really cool fine detail on them. When I got into birding, I was just trying to document it for my own instance. None of my photos are going to win any National Geographic awards, but they're good enough for me and I'm happy with that. And luckily, this skill transferred over really nicely. Almost all of the bird photos and all of the insect photos that you'll see in this presentation were taken by me through my microscope or through my spotting scope or binoculars. So some of them will probably be out of focus, but good enough for my purposes. You might think that having a microscope be a stationary object on a table and the insect specimen stationary on the pin, you can flip it over. I use it to identify however you want to. But with birds, not only are you having to move the binoculars, but the bird is moving too. And I'm sure we've all had that instance where you saw something and then it all of a sudden wasn't there, never to be seen again. So in some ways, birding is harder because you have to do the identifications in the field. But I wouldn't jump there quite so fast. Let's talk about animal diversity. So this pie chart here on the left represents the 1.6 million described species of animal on the planet. This blue section here represents about 83% of that diversity, which is 1.3 of the 1.6 million species on the planet are arthropods. So that's all of your crustaceans, all of your arachnids, all of your insects, everything with an exoskeleton and jointed legs can be found here in this blue section of the pie. That leaves just 365,000 species in this red section, which is everything else. Every mammal, reptile, amphibian, and bird is here in this red section of the pie. Looking at just bird diversity, there are about 1,100 or 11,100 bird species in the world, and that represents just 1/6,000% of total animal diversity on the planet. And I tried for a very long time to get the pie to show up with that, but it is too small of a number to work in these intervals. So looking at these numbers a slightly different way, worldwide there are 249 families of birds with about 11,000 species in them. All insects, there are 26 orders, which is one taxonomic step above family, but there are about 1 million described species of just insect. And the group that I work on, the beetles, there are 168 families, which account for about 450,000 described species on the planet. Makes up about 1/4 of all animal diversity is just in the beetles. And so identifying insects is really a lot harder because there's a huge disparity in the diversity that you're actually seeing in a certain area. Looking at the number of bird species recorded in different states across the US, Arizona is sitting here at number 4 with 606 species. 4 out of 50 is not terrible. We're sitting behind California, Texas, and Florida, and this is for all families of birds ever recorded in the state. Now, the diversity in just carabids, just the singular beetle family that I work on, we have 565 species in the state. That is just one family, and if we were to look at that in relation to all insects, there are about 20,000 species of insects known from the state of Arizona. So Identifying birds is a challenge because you have to basically do it in the field, but identifying insects is really difficult even when you do have them in hand because you have such way astronomically higher numbers of species to contend with. How do you do that though? So, how do you start approaching trying to identify insects? Well, you basically have to have a museum, and museums act as libraries of reference for insect specimens. As I mentioned before, I'm affiliated with the ASU Natural History Collections in Tempe, Arizona, and our building houses our herbarium, our fossil plant collection, our mammalogy collections, ornithology, and entomology. So any sort of biological specimen that the university has, we have it under our roof. And I specifically work with the Hasbrook Insect Collection, which had about 1 million specimens in it. In 2018, this couple right here, Charlie and Lois O'Brien, donated an additional 1.2 million specimens to the collection, effectively doubling our size overnight. Their collection has been certified by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest private insect collection in history. And there was also a documentary made about them called The Love Bugs that kind of details their collection and their donation of stuff to the university. It's on YouTube. I highly recommend taking a look at it if you can. What does that look like though? 2 million individual objects is kind of an abstract number for a lot of people. So let's take a look kind of behind the doors of what our insect collection looks like. We have these compactors here that allow you to adjust the width of rows. You'll see this sometimes in university libraries because it helps save space and you can fit a lot more material in because you can move the space between the rows. Each one of these holds these white metal double cabinets that hold 48 insect drawers, which are these wooden boxes here. The ASU Natural History Collection has over 10,000 of these individual insect drawers, and when you open them up, inside these drawers are roughly 2.5 million specimens. So if you open up one of these boxes, this is the kind of thing that you would see, nice little rows of insect specimens with labels underneath. This drawer in particular is all one species, but we do have mixed species, mixed family drawers, but we're working on kind of getting them all separated out. You might be thinking, well, why wouldn't pictures just work of these things now that we have an entire drawer of them? And it's not that these just represent the species, these also represent over 100 years of different collecting locations, different collectors, and different trips that people were on when they picked up these specimens. So under every single one of those 2.5 million specimens is a label that we have to type, print, and cut out in size 4 font that tells you where, when, and by whom that specimen was collected by. And so somebody in a couple weeks from now, a couple years from now, can come back and see exactly what I collected because that physical specimen is there with the information that you saw it at. And that's really important because it documents how places change over time. You have these insect specimens that could have been collected here at Hayden Ranch. Nice cover of trees. There's a stream running along the left-hand side that I had to crop out, but diversity of cactus on this dirt road. The insects that you could collect here would probably be pretty great because that habitat looks nice. That habitat today is the corner of McClintock University in Tempe, Arizona. So the insects that you would collect on the corner at this Shell gas station by my house is certainly going to be way different than what it was when you collected when this first photo was taken. And we have the benefit of hindsight looking back at, seeing where these things were collected before, but people in 100 years from now are going to be looking for where our specimens came from. So even though we have drawers of these things all being the same species, having more representation from where they are currently in time will benefit people down the line. So with insects, as I've mentioned, there are a couple of identification challenges, the first of which being just the incredibly high diversity. The second one I wanted to touch on are polymorphic species, species that can look pretty different even though they're all the same thing. If you saw these 3 ladybugs here on the left in the field, you would probably assume that those were all different. Those are all, in fact, Ola v nigrum, the ashy gray lady beetle. And the only way that you're really able to determine that is with characters underneath a microscope. We can do this now, and you could identify them from photos now, but if you had no frame of reference, you would think that these are 3 different things. Additionally, having those specimens in hand means that you're able to manipulate that specimen to be able to see different characteristics that you might not just be able to get with a photo. Like the underside of this beetle, when you're looking at birds, you can see the tail, the rump, the wings, the breast, the head, kind of all at once because they're standing relatively vertically. But with insects, they're kind of flat and usually running along the ground, so you can't see things underneath. And the only way to actually see some of the characteristics to help you identify them is by flipping them over. So having the specimen in hand with the microscope, you're able to do that. Additionally, there are some really small birds out there. Hummingbirds get pretty tiny, and there are some insects larger than the smallest birds, but insects can also get impossibly small. So the smallest insect known is about 1/10 of a millimeter. And finding that thing, identifying it in the field, would be next to impossible. So you see my ruler here on the left, and you might see some, think it's dust on the screen or whatever. But if you zoom in on this just little dot right there, that's an insect. That's a beetle that I pulled out of leaf litter, and I eventually mounted up and was able to identify. That's not something I would be able to do in the field because it's so incredibly small. You need specialized camera equipment. Again, you need to see things on the underside. So without having that available, it would be almost impossible to do. And these things live in rotting leaf litter that you have to shake out and then put through a special extraction thing to actually find these beetles. It's like the worst game of find the needle in the haystack that you can imagine. I would try to find the needle every single time rather than find this 1 millimeter beetle out in nature under some leaf litter. An additional thing that birders usually don't really think about is internal anatomy. So some of my beetles look so similar that the only way that you can separate them is by dissection. I spend more of my week than I would care to admit dissecting beetle genitalia, and that's what you can see here on the screen. These are all male intromittent organs from some of the beetles that I work with, and if I didn't have to do this, I probably wouldn't, but a lot of the time, this is the only way that I'm able to separate some of these very close species, because insect genitalia works like a lock and key. If you have what the key looks like, you can match it up and actually make the identification. But this is something that birders have probably never even thought about. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't ornithology collections. Of course there are, and the ASU Ornithology Collection has about 2,000 specimens and roughly 350 species. Not the biggest in the world by any means, but we do still have them in collections. However, you can't just collect birds anymore. Back in the day, you used to be able to go shoot things, bring them in nets however you really wanted to, and put them in collections that way. But because they're protected now under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the only way that ASU's ornithology collection really grows anymore are through things like window strikes, being hit by cars, electrocution. Really, they have to be found dead for them to be of any use to us. And they have to be found with someone with a permit that's legally allowed to handle them, because possessing any sort of bird part, alive or dead, is a federal crime. So we have permits to help do these sorts of things, but what that means is you can't just collect that warbler, bring it back, and try to identify it. You have to do it in the field, which is something that I've never really had to think about as an entomologist. So even though there are some really difficult identification challenges like the Cordilleran and the Pacific slope flycatcher, you have to be able to, and people do, identify them in the field. Sometimes it's just the slightest difference in the beak shape, in the shade of color that they're on, but ornithologists and birders have a tool that insect people usually don't, and that's sound identification. My beetles are silent. I can't hear them. I have to find them first, identify them later. Now, there are some entomologists that this is beneficial for. People that work on crickets or cicadas, insects that are kind of known for their sound, they can use sound ID to identify their species. But all of us bird folks, we have things like Merlin. The Merlin app, you can just open it up, it listens through your phone microphone, and it'll tell you when you're hearing a blue grosbeak or a northern cardinal. Now, of course, there are some reservations using this. You always have to double check if the thing is in range and whatever. But Merlin analyzes the waveform of the call and can tell you what you're hearing. There are birders that I would guarantee we could get out of the car at the same time. I could be looking around with my binoculars using all my senses. They could close their eyes and they could find more birds just by sound than I could with my eyes. It's a really incredibly impressive skill and tool for people to use. I'm working on it, but I'm not great at it yet. So this is something that I really find interesting coming from the world of insects where sound isn't super useful, but sound is a huge player and is one way that you can actually separate these really hard identifications like these two flycatchers here. The other thing that you can do with birds is even with just a cell phone, oftentimes you can get a photo that is somewhat usable. Is my lifer least bittern here going to win any National Geographic accolades? No. Is it enough for me to identify this as a least bittern? Yes. And that's something that, as an entomologist, especially with the beetles, I can't do. As I said, sometimes I need that genitalia out or I need those characters underneath. Butterflies, dragonflies, people can generally get away with it, but for the beetles that I work on, you definitely can't. But going back to kind of one of the issues or one of the hardships with birding is that birds move. I've taken a lot of photos that look like this. There's no bird, it's just a ripple, or the bird is taken off and it's just an empty tree branch. But if it comes back, you can try again and get a photo that is serviceable enough where you can identify it, especially later in the day, where you're not having to worry about that identification while you're out in the field. But why would we take photos of birds? If I were to report this American white pelican here from the riparian preserve, which is in fact where I saw it, as a community, the ornithologists have kind of said like, we probably believe you. You don't need to have a bird with a picture to submit it on eBird. There is kind of a honor system and a trust that you're identifying your birds correctly. Now, if it's something rare like the cackling goose or this pink-footed goose over here, you appease your eBird editors if you have a photo because they can verify that you're actually looking at what you say you're looking at. But sometimes, even for the rarities, just a really detailed physical description is enough for them to accept that record. And that is one of the strangest things to me as an entomologist was the honor system. So like I talked about before, every single one of those 2 million insects and however many I have in my personal collection, every single one has a label underneath that tells you where and when and by who was collected. In 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 150 years from now, long after my memory of collecting this specimen is gone, the physical thing is still there for people to look at. And sometimes that will not just outlive your memory, it will outlive you. So this butterfly is the oldest known insect specimen in the world. You can see the pin here, this handwritten label underneath. This was collected in May of 1702. This thing has been in a collection for 320 years, longer than the United States has been a country. And I've certainly seen some more recent insect specimens that have been more beat up. So I would say she looks pretty good for 320. But that long outlives just your observation. It also tells kind of a story, not necessarily just where and when these things were collected, but these specimens don't look like much. But to me, they are probably the coolest thing that I've ever personally laid eyes on, not only because they're ground beetles, and that's the group that I work on, and I love them so dearly, but if you look at these labels, these specimens were collected by Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, respectively. Historically, those names mean a lot, of course, in the field of biology. And even though these are just specimens, they're not type specimens or anything like that. It's just really cool to have that provenance of like who collected this thing and when, and that information is contained all within the label. Birding, you don't need to have that physical thing there with you. So let's take a look at this eBird list from January 2nd of this year. I was back home in Pennsylvania just at my local neighborhood park, and I saw these 9 species and 40 individuals. There's nothing out of place on this list, nothing unexpected, but it also wouldn't look very unexpected at all if this was 11 species and I had seen a bald eagle and a red-bellied woodpecker. But I didn't, but everyone on eBird just trusts that I didn't. And this kind of burden of proof and having the exact date and place that you saw something has been ingrained in me as an entomologist for the past 7 years. And so when I got into birding and there was no way or no need to prove anything, that was kind of difficult for me. And it really kind of formed how I run my personal birding journey. Let's talk about the blue jay for a second. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, and while the blue jay is not something common out here, I've probably seen thousands of them over the course of my life. But when I started birding, I was living here in Arizona. So this wasn't something that I was going to be able to see right away. And even though I, of course, knew what a blue jay was and had seen many of them over the course of my life, I didn't have that data that I'm used to with them of where and when I saw something. And so I kept the blue jay off my life list for a while. Instead of being one of my very early birds, it's number 127 on my list. Not terrible, but that was when I went home for Christmas break. I was back in Pennsylvania, and now I have the exact date and location that I saw this bird, and that kind of meets my personal data standards for how I run my list. As I mentioned earlier, I graduated from the University of Florida down in Gainesville in 2017. I was not particularly into birds at that point, and that is something that I kick myself for every day now because there's a lot of cool stuff down there. I was going all around the state seeing really cool wildlife, of course, the alligators, but the toads, the bats, the cool insects. I wasn't keeping track of where and when I saw the birds, though. I know exactly where I saw this frog or this toad. That's on my amphibian life list, but I wasn't keeping track of birds at that point. And even though I know I saw some really cool stuff, roseate spoonbills, a wild flamingo, and hingas, those things aren't on my life list as of yet because I don't have that standard of proof that I am used to as an entomologist. The one exception, of course, being Rosie, our resident spoonbill that kind of lives outside here. I saw her for the first time on October 30th last year. So the roseate spoonbill has made it back onto the list, but things like the flamingo and the anhinga still aren't. As I was kind of racking my brain about birds that I had seen in the past and how I could retroactively add things to my life list, I decided to go through my cell phone, all of my camera cards, and see if I had any photos. Not because I think you should have to have photos to add things to your list. Of course, we don't all have cameras or anything like that. But because that photo has a time and place attached to it, I have that data now that I so need for putting something on my list. So even though I added and made kind of a big deal about the Abird's towhee being my first bird, it's actually number 14 on my life list. And that's because going back through, I had photos of things like this Venezuelan tropial and bare-eyed pigeon from a family vacation to Aruba. I had this short-eared owl from our field station at Wichita State University. And I had this Heermann's gull from San Francisco Bay Area when I was out in California doing some insect research work. So because I had these photos, I was able to basically backdate where and when I saw these things. So they all have the data that I personally want to have with everything on my life list. So rather than being the Abert's towhee as the first thing I identified, my oldest bird as of right now is this white ibis that I saw at Disney World on my 21st birthday. So from 2016, that is my oldest thing currently on eBird. Maybe I find some older photos on a camera and I can backdate something even further. But for right now, the white ibis is number one on my life list. The last thing that I kind of wanted to speak on is the community aspect of doing both of these things. I have a Western Hercules beetle and a Ross's goose here on the left as individuals, but also the big groups of their friends that I collected them or found them with. And you can do both of these activities, of course, by yourself, or there is a larger community like you all here, the community of birders. This is a digital map of all of the insects that I've collected in the state of Arizona. These all represent separate collecting events. So if we were to click on one of these, they would kind of blow out and show you how many specimens that I collected at each one of these. You'll notice that there are some concentrated areas like over here near Portal, down south in Sierra Vista, around Phoenix, of course, but there's a lot of blank space there. So my goal when I go out trying to collect insects is to fill in this map. Going to new areas, finding a canyon that I've never been to, a mountain range that I've never even heard of before. I kind of open the atlas, spin my finger around and put it down and go there. And the reason for that is that new areas have the possibility for new, be it undescribed insects or just insects that I've never collected before. And so while I'm filling in these blank spaces, I'm going to these really pretty areas, but I don't anticipate seeing anybody else out there. I usually go out by myself or with a small group to these relatively remote locations and set up my light or go collecting. The way that I collect insects, I have this freestanding light set up with a really bright light bulb and a very loud generator. And another reason why I tend to go out far off the beaten path is I don't want to set this up next to a family camping and trying to enjoy their weekend. You know, slight common courtesy, slight love the aspect of discovery, but I go off the beaten path a little bit and do this. And my goal is usually not to see anybody else. If I find someone else, I clearly didn't drive far enough out into the desert because they found me. And that's not to say that all entomologists are hermits or recluses, whatever, being shut off by yourself. This is a photo from the infestation party down in Sierra Vista that was just held at the end of August. About 40 entomologists from the state and some from out of state drive down here at the end to kind of pick up on that last little bit of monsoon season to collect the insects that we're interested in. We're here for the weekend, enjoying each other's company, trading stories, trading specimens. But these people were all scheduled to show up in the same place at the same time. Anybody that I anticipate seeing in the field, I either brought them with me or were scheduled to meet at a certain place. I have run into another wild entomologist, if you will, something not expected, exactly one time in the past 7 years. And that's partly because of the way that entomologists work. We like to go off grid and find stuff that nobody else has. So sometimes we go to well-collected locations like the Southwestern Research Station, anywhere down in the Chiricahuas. Madera Canyon's another big one. Places that you all go to bird are also pretty good for bugs. But you just don't often see other people out doing the thing that you're doing. With birding, it's almost the complete opposite. On eBird, we have these hotspots, that places that are very well birded, and it tells you how many people have been there, how many birds people have seen, and because places are known for having a lot of birds, like the riparian preserve here, people keep coming back to all of these places. And there's a ton of empty space here on this map that people could fill in, and of course there are personal spots that you go birding that don't turn into hotspots. But I know, at least for me, I like to see birds when I go out birding. So I pick a place where there's a lot of birds that are known and people have been seeing them recently. So I pick these red hotspots here. And part of the other thing with the birding community is that it is many times larger than that of the insect community. In Arizona alone, we've got over 36,000 people registered working on eBird. And if we expand that to the entire United States, there are over 500,000 people, 575,000 people on eBird actively submitting lists from the United States. We don't have eBug as much as I would love that. We don't have quite the same database because insects are hard to identify. There's that barrier to entry of people doing it casually. The closest thing we do have is this website called Bug Guide, which is photos user submitted, and it fills in the map just of when people submit photos from a certain place. I emailed the people that run this site. They sent me to this nice data page here. There are 48,161 users that have ever made an account on Bug Guide. There are 676 that have posted something in the last 7 days. A lot of these accounts are probably people that had one bug that they were curious about and then haven't used again. Bug Guide is one of the tabs that opens when I open up the internet. I live on this website. So one of these is definitely me, but that community of only 48,000 people trying to work on 1 million described species versus 500,000 people on eBird working with 11,000 bird species. So the insect community is much smaller, very tight knit than the birding community because there are so many more people doing it. Not saying that you're not all tight knit, there are just more of you that you're able to make community events happen. But one of the other things with entomology is I'm not going out in the field with a big sign over my head that says, hey, I'm looking for bugs. And I very rarely personally, at least, carry a net with me, which is always the dead giveaway. But with birders, there's a uniform, basically. And you can see that in both of these photos here, going back to the tools that we talk about, not just the hat, the cargo pants, but the binoculars. Anytime you see someone with binoculars, you can always stop them and go, hey, have you seen anything good this morning? And they'll tell you about the woodpecker, duck, or warbler that they just picked out of a bush. With entomology, you don't get that because, again, I'm off doing it at night by myself. But with birders, we're all kind of converging on these hotspots and sharing the same material. Basically, we all want to see the same birds. So just kind of wrapping this up, what does it all kind of mean for me? I've had people in my life, my parents, my friends be like, so are you off that bug thing now? Are you switching to birds? And the answer is no. That's a very silly question for me of just how much I love working with insects. I've truly been lucky to find something that I love and kind of gotten into a field where I can continue to work with it. But I'm never going to be mad about learning something else and adding another part of nature really to my naturalist tool belt, being able to identify birds. And I've learned a lot over the past year, but there's still a lot that I don't know. So I don't intend on stopping birding anytime soon. I also don't intend on stopping working with insects anytime soon. But kind of the best way to think to wrap this up is to tell you a little bit about my weekend. So as I mentioned before, October 9th is my birdiversary. And that first week was down here at the Riparian Preserve, but this past weekend on Sunday, I went down to Sweetwater Wetlands. I found 35 species in roughly 2 hours, which my numbers are going up. That's pretty good. I saw a red-naped sapsucker was probably the best thing of the day. But what was I going down to Tucson for when there's plenty good birding right here at the Riparian Preserve? Well, October 9th this year just also so happened to be the day of the University of Arizona Insect Festival. So I was going down to Tucson for bug-related activities, but I got up early to go do some birding on the way. And that's kind of the thing. I'm not going to separate them. I have to do both. I'm very interested and I love doing both now. So I can split my Sunday. I'm happy to do that. With that, I'd like to thank everyone here at Desert Rivers for inviting me and having me speak. I'd like to thank my friends and colleagues at the Hasbrook Insect Collection and the ASU Natural History Collections as a whole. There are also some people I'd like to thank specifically. Dave Pearson, Alexa Stark, and Jake Thompson are my local group of birding friends, mentors, and colleagues. Without them and having them help me, coach me a little bit through this first year of birding, I don't know that I would have stuck with it quite as long, and my life list surely would not look as nice as it does without their help. I'd also like to thank Blaine Matheson, Russell Rogers, Steve Mason, and we can throw Dave back in here again, as people that I met as entomologists through the bug world that also do birding on the side. So I'm not the only one out here trying to manage both. I email all of my lists from every birding trip to Blaine, Russell, and Steve, and we all share our stories, both of insect collecting and birding as well. And lastly, I'd like to thank my family, my mom, Cindy Connors, and my grandparents, Jim and Peggy Waite, for supporting me through my entire life and the weird transition into bugs, and then kind of the 180 going into birds after that. So thank you all again for being here. If you have questions that you don't think of now, you can find me on social media, but I'm happy to take any questions at this time.